democracy now.
And will, to the best of my ability, preserve the...
Good afternoon and welcome to Antithesis.
Antithesis is a weekly radio soiree of stimulating commentary and entertaining conversation discussing issues of importance in our daily lives.
Antithesis airs Sunday afternoon at 5:30.
I'm Richard Curtis.
I'm Leo Griep-Ruiz.
The opinions expressed on Antithesis are the opinions of the person speaking them,
and do not necessarily represent the views of the board, staff, or management of KGNU or of us here at Antithesis.
because I might not agree with him.
And I might not agree with him.
The voice on the phone was muted, and not exactly urgent, but trying to convey something urgently. Jimmy's dead. Oh no, I responded. It was that hole again, that bottomless chasm which we are usually unaware of, but which accompanies all living beings until the moment that they fall into it. I looked down, trying to get one last glimpse of my friend, but I knew it was hopeless. I knew that he was gone forever. Until perhaps I follow him into those depths and we shall greet each other once again. Jimmy Omura was brave and humble. As a young man, he had stood up to the power of the United States government and challenged it to do its worst to him because justice was on his side and he knew it. It was World War II when President Roosevelt had ordered that all persons of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast be concentrated into camps which were hastily erected in desolate and out-of-the-way places. They were allowed to take only those personal goods which they could carry. After this wholesale removal of over 120,000 human beings from their homes, the young men over the age of 18 were first asked to volunteer and then sent induction notices. Get it? They were behind barbed wire with armed guards and watchtowers looming over them, and they were drafted. All of their possessions, their homes, their land, their vehicles, everything except what they could carry with their own two hands was gone. And they were expected to go off and fight for the government that was holding their families hostage as pawns in a possible trade for prisoners of war with the government of Japan. Well, some of them did volunteer, and others did agree to be drafted, thinking that in this way they could prove their loyalty to the U.S. They were sworn in, trained, and many of them formed into the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorating fighting unit in the United States Army. Many others, however, refused to enter into the armed forces until their families were once again allowed their constitutional rights. Their action in refusing to serve under those conditions was the source of tremendous controversy, both inside and outside of the camps. One of the persons who supported them was the young editor of the Rocky Mountain Shimpo, the Japanese community's newspaper published in Denver. This young newspaper man was my friend, the late Jimmy. Among the repercussions for his courageous act of conscience was his being ostracized from the press, and in large part from community life. You might have seen Jimmy on the job. You might have seen him driving to or from work. He was a gardener, a Japanese gardener. It is a stereotype which is fast fading from the American scene, but it was certainly one of the prevalent images of Japanese men in this country during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. My thoughts turned to memories of Jimmy as I listened to a recent radio program commemorating the life of another warrior for justice who was passed on to the spirit world, Judy Berry. Judy was one of the organizers who did the seemingly impossible. She organized a broad-based movement involving environmentalists and loggers in support of ecologically sound, sustainable logging in the Pacific Northwest. Most folks outside of California had not heard of her until the day that her car blew up, almost killing her and severely injuring her companion and fellow organizer, Daryl Cherney. The FBI arrested her as she lay near death on a hospital bed on charges of possessing and transporting an explosive. She was later cleared of all charges in court. Interestingly, none of the death threats that she received before the actual bombing have been examined for leads in tracking down the actual perpetrators of that cowardly act against a person who was never known to have done violence to anyone. She is sorely missed. She's sorely needed. A few years ago, I spent a lot of time with ranchers, cattle ranchers. I drank coffee with them and listened to them talk about their concerns as brucellosis claimed more and more of their herds. I understand the issues surrounding cattle, especially cattle on public land. And I am entirely sympathetic with the ones who are raising their concerns about the degradation of the countryside and the taxpayers' support of ranching through various deals, including access to public lands. I certainly understand that it takes an inefficient amount of vegetable protein to produce animal protein. But as I read this, I am wearing leather boots and a leather belt. In my pocket is my glass case, which I made of 3 kinds of leather: steer, goat, and water buffalo. I eat meat. Most of you do too. And I am always amused by the self-righteous dietary missionaries who go off on any available carnivore but who are wearing leather as they speak. The ranchers sneer at the thought of the tree huggers whose only contact with the out-of-doors is on an occasional weekend spent well wrapped in $1,000 worth of Gore-Tex. This chasm of misunderstanding represents the distance that must somehow be breached in order to come up with a workable scheme for land use now and into the future. The late Judy Berry breached that gap. It's sad that she's gone because we need her, or someone like her, right here in Colorado. South central Colorado is the scene of one of the most brutal assaults upon the integrity of the land in recent memory. The logging currently underway in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the southeastern part of the San Luis Valley is a devastation of the land without precedent in the area. It is being carried out almost as if intended to ruin the Culebra River watershed. The small farmers and ranchers downstream of the logging operation are living in fear of the erosion which threatens to clog the streams and irrigation ditches which they have maintained sustainably for generations. Much, much more than farms and ranches are being threatened. It's a whole way of life. I never met Judy, but I am certain that she and Jimmy would have hit it off well. They were both persons of rare personal courage, and they both dedicated their lives to nurturing living things. Their lives are a challenge to all of us to back up our words with our actions.
That was Leo.
Yep.
Well, that's a heavy piece.
It's a heavy deal.
Yeah.
It is a heavy deal.
So you want to talk about organizing?
Well, there's a whole bunch of issues in there. You know, on the one hand, we do have the business of broad-based united front organizing, which is something that continually escapes those who think of themselves as the left. And then I think also there is the issue of this logging that's going on in the San Luis Valley, which is bad news, real bad news. And, you know, I think there's also some other questions which have to do with journalists' role around issues like this.
And that's a big one. Boy, when you bring that up immediately, I start thinking about the death of the free press in this country and how it basically doesn't exist anymore. I mean, we're talking about corporate press now, and Jimmy Omura, that was his name, alienated from the press. Well, it doesn't surprise me because it's a corporate entity now, and you don't say the right thing, and you are going to be.
And you ought to know about that.
Yeah.
Should introduce our guest in the studio this afternoon, Pam White.
Hi.
Managing editor of the Colorado Daily and a woman well accustomed to being criticized.
Yep, criticized, ostracized, whatever. Yeah.
Thanks for coming in again.
Oh, well, you're welcome. Yeah, and the other issue that I see present in your piece there, Leo, is the continued destruction of old ways of life by corporate entities. It's happening in the San Luis Valley with Zach Taylor's ranch. It's happening in Arizona and New Mexico with the traditional Diné. It happened, you know, with Japanese Americans during World War II. This is a pattern. This is not isolated incidents like everybody wants to think it is.
You know, there's something that's real interesting about what went on with the Japanese in the Second World War. My wife and I have talked about this a lot. She is Japanese American. Her earliest childhood memories are of playing in the shadows of these guard towers in the camp that they were in Manzanar, in the desert, in the Mojave Desert. And one of the things we've discussed is how there was a whole generation of Japanese American women who did not have the Rosie the Riveter image. This is a very interesting concept. If we look at what went on with most of the women in the United States, especially going into the 60s, there was a kind of hidden but present cultural memory of having done man's work, of having
Being
taken
in
over,
the factories.
of having worked in the factories, you know,
Yeah.
of having done that stuff. And then there was a kind of culture shock that set in as soon as the men came back and they were pushed out and back into the home.
That's right. Go home and bake a cake, lady.
And that kind of, that created a certain kind of tension, which I believe resulted in a lot of what we saw in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of which did not occur at the same time in the Japanese American community, because the women were taken off into the camps as the men were taken off into the camps, and what they did in the camps tended to be that which they had done before going into the camps, which is largely taking care of their families.
Not having that work experience outside the home.
And there's also something that very few people know about, that virtually everything that had anything to do with Japan, photographs of people in Japanese clothing, documents that were written in Japanese, books, clothing, all of those artifacts, instruments, many of those things were all lost, were all destroyed. People were so freaked out when what amount to the busts, man, when the dragnets came down and people were taken away, they were so freaked out that there were incidents like the one that my wife recounts that her mother has told her about, and obviously it really affected her mother very much, watching my wife's, those baby footprints, you know, that they do at the hospital, those ink prints. She even burned that. There was such a frenzy of burning documents. People were so, like I said, just flipped out because they had no idea that they tried to instantly have no past. So there is all of the documentation of an entire generation's history is lost. And I think that when some people would say, well, gee, that's pretty far jump from that stuff to what's going on in the San Luis Valley, boy.
Not at all.
Not at all, exactly, because here again we have the wholesale destruction of documents that tie people to the land. And in the case of the Taylor Ranch, we have the late Jack Taylor, who bought the land, changing the language in the title to exclude the local community from their legally recognized exercise or enjoyment of what are called the usufruct rights of the land, which means they could continue to hunt, to fish, to gather wood, to camp, as they had always done. Activities which would not interfere with the operation of the ranch.
Well, I think communal use is in direct contradiction to private control.
Well, they evidently see that pretty clearly, because the Taylors have done everything they can to, I don't know, really develop, enhance, promote their own selfishness in this instance.
And the law's on their side.
Oh yeah, the law is on their side. Nobody's going to say, look, you're ruining the way of life of the earliest immigrants to this region. I mean, the farmers who were there are descended from, some of the first people to come into this area from outside. We have a Hispanic culture there that goes way back, and these people are being really disenfranchised from their own heritage.
And we should also add that many of the people in the valley are the descendants of the indigenous people of the area. That the individuals who went to the furthest outposts at the time of the Spanish occupation of what they called Nueva España, of Greater Mexico, of all of what the Nahuatl-speaking region is, the ones who went to the furthest extremes of that were the kind of people who generally didn't like to be under somebody's thumb. And they intermingled to a great degree with the people who were already there. And there is a whole subculture of folks known as comancheros, the ones who were the bridge between the Hispanicized communities, you could say, and the traditional indigenous communities. And places like San Luis are the kinds of communities. And when we speak of San Luis, we should point out that we're talking actually about 7 separate communities that all of together are the general community of the San Luis area there. There is also that tradition there. I know people who still have the buffalo lance their great-grandfather used.
Wow.
Folks don't realize that buffalo roam the San Luis Valley. So there's a lot of stake. But I'm really more interested in this issue of broad-based United Front organization.
Yeah, I think that's the thing we really ought to talk about. Tell us a little bit more about these cattle ranchers. You know, in talking about environmentalists with them, you know, that's the key. Is we all got to come together and see our common interest here.
And that's, I think, the problem. Too many people spend too much time focusing on their own interests and don't realize that if they want to protect the trees, for example, they're going to have to look at the system overall and see how the entire thing functions. Because as one great feminist scholar said, there's no hierarchy of oppression here. When you're talking about race, you're talking about gender, you're talking about trees, you're talking about farmers in the San Luis Valley. It's all the same thing.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I think the greatest mistake that people make is thinking that the environment is something outside of them. You know, human beings are as much a part of the global ecology as any other creature that has metabolic functions. You know, and the environment is inside of us as well as outside of us. Not only is our skin a permeable membrane, but our body is really nothing more than a convoluted tube. You know, if we stop and think about it, you know, from our mouth to our other end, you know, it's just a tube. It's just a tube. It kind of takes some twists and turns and stuff, but it's just a tube. You know, the environment, that which goes in our mouth, really, we think of it as being inside of our body, but we might just as well think of our lungs and our esophagus and our stomach and our intestines as being outside of ourselves.
Well, this is one thing that I think is particularly emphasized in Western culture, and that is that somehow we're not our animal selves, the separation, and you can see it all the way back to the Greeks, between your body, your mind, and your spirit. They're not intertwined at all for these people. They're separate. The body is icky and strange, and it's unfortunate we're stuck in it, and we're separate from it, and we're separate from nature. We are not animals.
So once we get to the point of understanding, you know, when we say environment, I'm talking about what's inside me as well as what is outside of me, and what it is that I am inside of, which is all of that which is considered the outside. And if you can't follow that, tough, you know.
Well, no, I want to get back to the ranchers.
Right, that's where I'm going, is to the ranchers. These ranchers, these people are people that live in the outside.
Right.
A cattle rancher probably spends more time with, cattle ranchers spend more time with wrenches and hammers and socket sets in their hands working on heavy farm equipment than they do actually with their hands on an animal. That's the first thing I want to point out, you know, especially the ones that raise their own alfalfa, do that kind of thing. The business of farming is largely the business of being a heavy farm equipment mechanic.
Yeah, fixing stuff. The second law of thermodynamics.
That's the first thing that I think a lot of folks need to understand. Secondly, they live outside every day. Every day, 365.25 days per year, farmers, ranchers are outside. Whether they don't go outside because the snow has stopped. They don't go outside after the rain just to breathe a nice, clean, fresh air. They're out there in all of it. There's no day off. That's something else a lot of folks don't understand or appreciate.
But what did they have to say?
Well, probably what you'd imagine they had to say.
Well,
you know?
the ranchers and farmers I've known have been small farmers, small ranchers, and they're people who had a deep appreciation for environmentalism.
in a way that is very, very real. Though actually a lot of these ranchers that I knew, a lot of them ran cattle on public land. A lot of them ran cattle on Forest Service land. You know, so because of my role in this particular community, I didn't really shoot my mouth off about what I thought about a lot of these things like subsidies for them, because I was just listening. I was listening to what they had to say. And the first thing that I think is important to appreciate is that if you got a square inch of leather, man, if you got, you know, I mean, how many vegetarians out there, how many of these confirmed vegans have got some kind of cool little leather pouch around their neck, you know, or something else?
Well,
Leather
you know,
hair.
I think that
it's- it happens, but I think
that
not
is
really
an important issue.
Why?
Because of the inconsistency that is manifested by that kind of behavior, and it's precisely that kind of inconsistency that folks like a lot of these ranchers that I was around really look down on.
I mean, if you're going to wear an animal, you might as well eat the animal.
Or if you don't want to eat the animal for all of the obvious dietary reasons, then you got to deal with that issue of leather. And if you're going to have leather around, then you got to deal with the fact that somebody grew the animal, that, you know, assuming it's not wild, you know, harvested out in the forest, you know, deer or something like that. You've got to deal with the fact that somebody raised it, and that somebody who raised it, that leather is probably a byproduct of meat, of the beef industry. What I heard these guys talking about was their concerns about beef prices going down. I heard them seriously concerned about various kinds of diseases, brucellosis, which causes spontaneous abortions, you know, miscarriages among cows. And I also heard them being very, very critical of the environmental movement in general, largely because they felt that they were dealing with people who, as I said, go out into the wild on an occasional weekend jaunt, you know, wrapped up in $1,000 worth of Gore-Tex.
Well, that's just too easy. I mean, of course that's true. You know, it certainly is true, but it's too easy.
Well, I'm not justifying what they said.
Okay.
You know, I'm just recounting what they said. You asked me, what did they say? I told you that's
well,
what they
what are we
said.
going to do to get past that?
Well, that's the issue. That's why I brought up the matter of Judy Berry. That's the issue. You know, how do we get to the point of being able to do broad base united front organizing?
Well, I don't know. You know, that is a hard thing because, you know, they've tried that, or I should say we, I don't know, Davey, who it was, tried to do that in the feminist movement. You know, white women, women of color, rich women, poor women, all women are sisters, right? And we still can't do that. And we all agree on so many issues, and we still can't do that. And I don't know why we can't do that. I really don't have an answer. If one of you does, that'd be really cool. I'd like to hear it. I'll write a column about it next week.
Well, I actually have an answer about that.
Okay, all right.
Well, which has to do with class interests. That there certainly are a large number of people who are involved in industries like cattle ranching or logging, who are who come out of the capitalist class. You know, their interest is in the owning, is in the property interest, in protecting their right to exploit property. Whereas on the other side, the environmental side, the interest is a larger sense of property that is more communal. That, you know, the earth is kind of the property of us all, and we have to take care of it so that we can continue to survive.
Well, go ahead.
Well, the problem in the feminist movement is identical. Is that the interests of wealthy women and poor women are clearly not identical, and that they are in fact just as opposed as they are with rich men and poor men.
And once you get past the issue of abortion, yeah, you're right about that. And the issues that face poor women only become interesting to rich women when they actually affect rich women. But when it comes to ranchers and environmentalists, I think clearly they're at odds as far as what they want to do. When we're talking big ranchers here, I think small ranchers, what they do could almost be called macrobiotic. But for example, Zach Taylor.
Macrobiologic.
Yeah, I mean they're growing it, they're eating it, they're plowing, they're dealing with their machines, they're talking to their cows once in a while. I mean they know what's going on out there. They're a part of their land. they're dealing with it in a very close to the earth sort of way. And actually, there are some beef farmers who are taking an environmental stance now. And I just ate some of it recently. And it was really good, and I can't for the life of me tell you what it was. But you know, the big
before you
ranchers-
use any proper names, let me caution you that we got to watch out for all those radio rules.
Oh, radio rules.
Right,
Radio
radio,
rules.
radio
on
rules.
radio?
Yeah,
Oh my God.
yeah, yeah.
You wouldn't
yeah.
believe it.
So let's speak in terms of generalities and just say to our listeners that you can add whatever proper noun you would like to attach to this on your own, and just leave it at that.
Just leave it at that. Well, anyway,
You were going to say about
I don't even remember. What was
I thought of something though while we were doing all this, which was the Judy Berry thing, the genius of her organizing, which I think was that she talked to, rank and file loggers, the people who were getting paid to do this kind of stuff. And I think that working class loggers had a different consciousness that enabled them to see that they did share interests with the environmental movement. And she brought that out. She was able to talk their talk and on both sides of the fence.
And that's what could happen with these small ranchers. We have to make the distinction between small ranchers, and I'll include people that sell off 300, 400, 500 head a year as a small rancher.
Well, I think it is,
compared
yeah.
to agribusiness.
Right,
right,
exactly.
the huge ranchers. Yeah, exactly. Distinguish between one and the other, because I think their interests are very similar to the interests of environmentalists, and if they don't realize that, then that's a failure of communication on the part of the environmental movement. I really think that needs to be pointed out to them. And I think the reason Judy Berry, they tried to assassinate her, and that's what I believe it was because she was so effective that she was scaring them to death. What's she going to do? Turn the people who work for the logging industry against their bosses? I mean, when people talk about terrorism in Oklahoma City, I'm sorry, terrorism is a part of American life. It's happened for a long time. That was nothing new.
A little grander scale.
Yeah. And, I mean, it's a little off the topic there, but I just wanted to point that out.
Well, there were efforts being made to try to get Judy Berry to come out to Colorado. The first time that she was supposed to come out to Colorado, she was not able to make it because she got blown up.
There we have it.
And then there have been efforts to bring her out since that time, and her health would not allow it.
And the FBI was clearly complicit in what happened to her. I mean, if you read the reports about it, they knew much more than they wanted to state, and they were very involved. And I think the reason they were is because they realized she was a threat. And the FBI and the CIA, they really work for the people who have money.
Yeah, the whole story around that investigation, or lack thereof, just points out the obscenity behind a lot of what the FBI does. Arresting the woman in the hospital.
And that raises another issue in terms of trying to do broad-based United Front organizing, which is that we have no idea what kind of destabilization, disinformation campaigns, what is going on when we do get some kind of organizing that looks like it's going to be effective. Because we can look at L.A., when the U.S. organization and the Black Panthers were shooting at each other on the strength of scurrilous letters that were being put out by the FBI as part of COINTELPRO.
And just when you start saying something important, someone comes along to shut you up.
Well, here it is. It's Spike Jones. Again, folks, that sounds like it's time for us to get out of here. You're listening to Antithesis. Once again, we want to thank Pam White for being here in the studio with us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. I'm Richard Curtis.
I'm Leo Griep-Ruiz.
Thanks for checking out Antithesis, 5:30 p.m. each and every Sunday on KGNU, Boulder.
And Denver, don't forget.
And Denver, I keep
there are
doing that.
people out there that can hear us. God.